The dreadful day had finally arrived. I lay in the sacred stone pool. Vases of anointed fresh water had been added while I silently cleansed myself of any impurities. Out of all the girls in the orphanage, I was selected for reasons beyond my understanding. I was inspected to ensure I was of good health, looks, and was unblemished. Only the best for the divine. I wasn't asked whether this was what I wanted, chanting to myself, over and over, "The gift is mine to give. The gift is mine to give. It is theirs to receive. It is theirs to receive. My life is theirs. My life is theirs." The honor was mine whether I wanted it or not. I remembered how I was taken from my home. When I was barely a girl, I saw the faces of my parents crying while being handed coin at sword point before being taken away, blindfolded over the course of several days. No one spoke to me during. I was scooped up and taken to a wooden house in the middle of nowhere where the other girls resided. I screamed at them to take me back home, and I wanted to see my parents. I hated being here. No one spoke to me, and I was utterly alone. The combined sources of moonlight and starlight were the only sources of light in the sky. I ignored the idle chatter that surrounded me from the heavily veiled priestesses, each only identifiable from the bone skull mask she wore. None spoke to me, and nor would I to them. The yellow-white, mostly melted candles surrounded the edge. The wax leaked down as flame after flame slowly died, only to be replaced by one of the priestesses, who left as quick as she could. Leaning on the cool surface, I heard a bell in the distance, and knew my time had arrived. Rising from the pool of water, my nakedness was barely concealed with a white linen gown that gripped my curves. I shivered with the cold, and walked barefoot down into the sacred grove down below. In the center was the sacrificial altar, large and made from smooth black stone, with vines twisting around the edges, and screaming human faces carved into it. I was alone, and I stopped, staring down at the dark brown stain of all the previous sacrifices that had leaked onto the floor. I hesitated, remembering that I wasn't permitted to show fear. I gripped my hands to prevent them from trembling, staring down at them when I saw shadowy figures moving along the boundary line, and knew my time had come. I climbed on the altar, lay back and gazed up at the sky. There was no sign of the moon nor the stars. I kept wishing this wasn't the end. My arms by my side, wrists up, and watched for the unknown fate set to befall me. I was left waiting, with only the sound of my frantic beating heart, and knowing I would meet my end. My fist clenched tight, closing my eyes, and I felt a tear fall down my cheek. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to die so they could live forever. My chest rose and fell, my heart quickening, and the whites of my knuckles, as my fist clenched, were the only sign that I didn't want this. A masked priestess pulled my hair out from under me, rested on either side of my face, and used her hand to tilt my chin up, exposing my tender neck to whatever may come. She took one of my hands, firmly opened it, and placed it by my side, palm up, and the soft wrist was exposed, before giving the other the same treatment. My gown was torn down the center, and pulled to either side, revealing my naked body to the night sky, and I heard the priestess leave. Only the crickets and the faint singing of birds could be heard. A moment of tranquility. I desperately tried to ignore the memories of seeing the mutilated remains of previous sacrifices being taken out, a pile of broken limbs Loose flesh and crushed bones were removed in the arms of the priestesses. The anticipation led to nothing. I opened my eyes and turned my head to the side, wondering when it would be unleashed, when I heard frantic screaming coming from where I had come. Soon one scream turned into many, and the distinct sound of large bones being crushed. Wondering what was happening and what the sound was, and rolled over to the opposite side of the altar, using it to shield myself. None would dare enter and attack. I barely saw it at first. The shadow formed, and a figure appeared out of the foliage of the trees, taking form in a frantic whirl as worlds collided, and a tall, shadowy figure, with two large horns rising to the sky, moved through the mist and stopped just outside the boundary. Only once it got closer, I saw the skull it spoke through and shivered, peeking over the top. I waited to see what would happen next, and a clawed hand reached out, beckoning me to come closer. It waited, perhaps growing impatient with my hesitancy, and I stood with the altar in front of me. Animalistic, inhuman whispers of the Horned One filled my mind. Stories of his wickedness, and the fact he now walked the earth meant all the sacrifices had failed. The passing of thousands of women and girls had been for nothing.
Come, your world is no more.
The deep, growling voice emanated from the pale skull. Eyeless socket stared at me whilst I could do nothing. He towered over me, over the tallest person I had ever met, and the eerie stillness about him. I could barely see the outline of his body. Who was this devil? While horned, he didn't seem like the one that was whispered about.
There is nothing for you here other than corpses of fools and liars. Their rituals were pointless, weak, and impotent.
I couldn't tell if he was studying me or not. He sensed my hatred, my loathing, and most importantly, my fear. Reading my thoughts of the brutality I had experienced and seen, I was pulled forward with a clawed hand, brought toward that terrifying mask, and I gazed into the pits of death itself.
I will give you the tools to crush your enemies.
He gave me the option I would never have dared take for myself. Unable to enter the circle, it waited just outside, standing while the flames from the candles faded, leaving nothing but a growing darkness. The god creature before me was born of death, foliage, and the darker side of nature itself, and yet he would be my sole way out. I was now finally free to choose what I desired, and I decided that a potential death was better than a slow, lingering death through starvation. I moved to stand close to him, in arm's reach, and waited. My hand extended out to take his, a physical connection now in place. The circle surrounding me cracked, the stones broke into two, and the altar behind me sank into the earth. The shifting sound of soil made me recoil, close my eyes, and pray there would be no more. I walked alongside him, and we moved through the forest in silence, stepping over the twisted and mutilated remains of the priestesses. Their heads had been pulled nearly completely off, their faces twisted in terrified expressions, and arms curled in a foolhardy attempt to prevent their deaths. Their eyes were white, mouths open in gruesome ways, from their jaws being broken, and I gazed down in mild curiosity rather than expected fear. Some were hacked open, from groin to sternum. How they were selected for such suffering was beyond me, and the horned devil did not enlighten me. Each step through the gore brought me further away. Was he my rescuer or my captor? We walked through the forest for countless days and nights in silence, through parts I had never seen. My legs and feet ached. I left footprints of dry and fresh blood wherever I stepped. We moved through forbidden areas where their secrets and power dwelt. The priestesses were powerful figures, near gods to me in their own right. But now I saw their regalia, items I thought were divine, that were simply wooden props that were moved, and now I knew it had all been a lie. Their control was a falsehood, and yet even with it revealed to me, I still fought to cling to what I already knew. Only those who were initiated were permitted to walk through here, and I purposely tried to avoid looking through the foliage, in case I'd see horrors I wouldn't be able to understand. The guilt was immense. The pathway was limited, made of dirt and large eroded stones, created a line to follow, and I struggled to keep up with him, while he moved through effortlessly, shadowed and twisted. The old pathway of a long-forgotten road kept me moving forward, and I prayed that I wouldn't be lost in here.
Only death brings new life.
He spoke cryptically, and I knew it had to mean my own. Yet ever obedient, I followed him, having nowhere else to go, and perhaps this would be a reprieve. We looked over the horizon to see a small cabin, with a chimney with smoke coming from it down below. I never heard of good people residing there. They were barbarians, murderers, heretics, the worst of the worst, people who never told the truth, and who would try to turn us away from our true path, those who had been tainted with the outside world, who were cesspits of corruption.
I must see if you are worthy.
He handed me a blade crafted from a twisted root. It was curved around the base. Only the blade itself looked sharp, and I turned it in my hand. The first time I ever held a weapon.
You must strike them down. Their blood must feed the earth. Then we will be reborn.
How could a god be reborn? The knife trembled, perhaps with a life of its own, and for a second I thought it pulsed, and I made my way toward the cabin at a walk. Every step was hard. Why would I want to go near them? Ever since childhood I'd been warned about their deviancy. They refused the truth. They called out to me in a language I couldn't understand, that caused me to jump. I looked back at the god creature. He stood still, idle, in clear view of the doorway, and I realized they couldn't see him. Their clothing didn't make sense. It resembled men's clothing rather than a woman's. Their legs were covered, and they were without skirts. Their arms and cleavage were exposed indecently. I, in a state of undress, perhaps was being too cynical. Their faces were painted with cosmetics, and pictures drawn on their arms, and they tapped at a strange rectangle with equally painted fingernails before a bright light and a voice came from it.
911, what is your emergency?
I was too confused by them to understand what was happening.
Stay focused. You need to kill them.
They couldn't hear him. If they didn't take me by the shoulder, I would have turned and ran. Even with his urging, equally, I would have tried to fight them if I wasn't so exhausted. They didn't threaten me.
Hello, there's a woman out here. I think she's lost. Fuck, she's naked and covered in blood.
She sounded panicked and genuinely concerned.
What's your location? Stay on the line with me.
I'm in the Blackburn Forest, on the northern side.
Is she being followed?
No, not that I can see.
Is anyone else there with you?
There was a sharp, crackling sound.
I think she's from this group, this cult in the woods nearby.
She turned her back, speaking privately, and I didn't know what they were talking about. I couldn't understand who she was speaking to. Perhaps an evil spirit they were in contact with. They had to be deceitful. They couldn't have been kind people. The priestesses couldn't have been wrong. Yet, the two women approached me with gentle outstretched arms and would glance at each other. Their eyes had water in them, and I took it as concern. but they had to be trying to reassure me to hurt me. One rested her hand on my bare forearm, and I flinched at her touch. She removed it but stood close to me. I felt a pang of guilt over what I knew I had to do. I kept the blade low, hidden, and they brought a warm blanket to wrap around my shoulders, perhaps the first sign of comfort I had received from when I was stolen from my parents. Hell, the first time I'd been offered warmth in my memory. A kind gesture that made me question what I needed to do. On either side, they guided me inside, and I hesitated at the doorway, my eyes wide in fear, dreading being trapped inside with them and losing my chance at freedom. The door was closed behind me. I expected to see corpses or sign of danger, but instead, it was warm. A lit fire inside, a privilege reserved for people higher than me, and I instantly felt self-conscious, even though I stepped over their remains. I felt they were still watching and judging my actions, ready to appear from the shadows to spot me committing a sin. I was nearly seduced by the promise of warmth. I took 3 steps inside and stared in amazement at what I saw. Their home was decorated with items I saw in the big house that I didn't own, and nor was I able to use. Their table had plates with warm, delicious food, and my stomach growled. Several plates in the middle with different options, and far more than I'd ever been permitted to eat. It looked like a paradise, and surely they had only managed to gain this through wicked means. Still, I felt conflicted. As the door locked, I knew he would be in the doorway, his body now shadow rather than physical, and they were oblivious to his presence.
Do not forget your task.
He insisted. I didn't want to waste too long in case I lost my resolve. I imagined them going to a better place, and their deaths would be a good thing. Closing my eyes, and with my teeth pressed tightly together, I imagined that it wouldn't hurt them. Perhaps the god creature would take their pain away. I lifted the dagger and plunged it into the neck of one of the women. A burst of blood squirted up from it and sprayed the room. She tried with one hand to frantically stop the bleeding, while the other pushed me away. I couldn't resist opening my eyes and saw the sheer look of betrayal in hers. Her mascara smudged down her face. Her blood was hot. It trailed down my arm and sprayed my face, while the other screamed in fear and anger. It took her a moment before she started trying to pry me off. I'm sorry. He told me to. I have to do this. I pleaded with them while they screamed at me. I kept hoping they would understand where I was coming from. The first one lay on the floor in a pool of blood and was starting to fade away. I turned all my attention to the other. I wrapped my hand around her black hair, yanked her backward, and repeatedly stabbed her in the torso. Some of the stabs barely grazed her. She roared in pain and anger, viciously kicking out at me to push me off her, and I coughed when she managed to get one good kick to my stomach. Winded, I kept going, driven on by the god creature's guidance. I saw him peering through the window this time, all to witness my attempt.
Only one more. Be careful. She may kill you.
I don't know if he was lying to encourage me or not. She kept using her arms to block my attempts, and in my weakened state, she knocked me to the ground. I scrambled to stand up, dropping the knife, and managed to get it back in my hand. I expected her to hit me, stab me, or do anything in order to have revenge. She kept screaming at me, but her words were all blurred into a jumbled mess while I kept striking with the knife.
Don't stop. She'll go to a better place. She will become one with many.
She couldn't hear him. I'm helping her. I'm helping you, I insisted through bitter grit teeth. I stabbed her thigh, causing her to release my arms, and stabbed her multiple times in the chest. Her tight grip started to loosen around my wrists, and a sad look of betrayal came across her face. Her body went limp as the life drained from her, and while I stared at her, I wasn't sure if I had made a terrible mistake. I felt him beside me, standing there, and he reached down into the blood with his hands. Now close, I could see he was a mixture of flesh and plant fused together in an unholy blend. The red liquid nourished him. I saw it pulsing through his veins, and it took me a while to realize he was feeding through his hands. Even the blood stain on the floor faded to a damp patch. This time, he placed his hands on both of the corpses at the same time. He drained them of any remaining blood, but it didn't end there. He broke through their rib cages and continued to feast, and soon dry husks were all that remained, leaving nothing but leathery skin, bone, and clothing.
I feel well again.
A low groan followed that ended in a growl.
Now, tell me, what lesson did you learn from this?
What lesson was there to have from this? I don't know, I answered honestly, unable to lie, and heard a muffled voice coming from their rectangle. It was relatively quiet now. Picking it up, I looked at it more closely. The sounds continued. I wasn't sure how to stop the sound or change it. A fuzzy, crackling sound would occasionally pierce my ears, and I threw it away, causing it to break into 3 parts. Then I picked those and threw them into the fireplace. The pieces let off a foul odor as it melted, and I gazed at them in fascination.
Follow me.
I turned and followed the god back out into the woods. No matter how fast my pace was, I could never catch up to him. He was always just out of reach. The blood on my chest slowly dried, and I noticed our pathway declined. We were going deep into the earth, and the air felt heavy here. Where are we?
Where you will be born, where death meets life, and you will see for the first time.
Human skeletons hung from iron hooks, and were held by a rope from the ceiling of the cave, some by the neck and others by their wrists. They gently spun in place. Some were a stark white, while others were coated in a thick layer of dirt and dust, their jaws barely clinging on. Pits where long decomposed eyes stared out idly. Some still retained skin, and pieces of flesh with rotted clothing, hanging in tattered clumps. Who they were, and why they were here was unknown to me. They slowly span around, and the god creature walked past them. Strangely, with some moving through his body, while others lifted and dropped when he walked through. I couldn't tell if he was shadow or physical. "Who are you?" I whispered, not expecting a response, and I certainly didn't receive one. "Where are we? Who are they?" I asked, fearful I would soon join their number. I noticed a light streaming inside from above, and saw a hole in the cave. I stared up into the light, and gasped when I saw stars shining in the night sky, coupled with light from the sun, and the moon was close to meeting. An eclipse, a sign of great change approaching. I expected a sharp chill, or another ominous sign. Instead, the temperature was relatively warm, and the beauty of the sky above nearly distracted me. The cave itself surrounding the light grew dark, and I stared at him in confusion. He stood closer now. The faint scent of wet soil and bark filled my nostrils. Neither were unpleasant.
It is time. You are ready to receive it.
Receive what exactly? He reached inside his chest cavity, twisting past the ribs, and wrapping his hand around his black, twisted heart, offering it to me. Still beating, and I reached out to take it with my hand. The blood trickled down his arm.
Feast on it, and you will be reborn.
It was almost encouraging. I took it in my hands, staring while it pulsed and burned. The sizzling echoed throughout the cave. I had to crack and pull away the hard shell surrounding it to reveal the thick yet supple meat. It continued to pulse with slow and steady beats, and I never knew the gods had hearts that could be consumed. I paused before sinking my teeth into the flesh. I struggled to pierce it, and I gazed up into the hollow pits for eyes of the previously forgotten god. If it felt pain, it showed no sign. However, how much I studied him, I knew I'd never completely understand.
Keep going. You have much work to do.
It breathed. It insisted. And as I swallowed piece by bloody piece, I could feel it twist inside my body, changing me, altering every part of me. I felt it squirming in my stomach, and struggled to continue feasting on the heart and choked, nearly vomiting it up. My hand held my stomach, and it sat there, completely immune.
You have to finish it all, or it won't work.
I hoped he wouldn't say that. It was half eaten now. Mangled mouthfuls had taken large chunks out, yet it continued to beat as though it was still in his chest. My stomach turned and I closed my eyes, sinking my teeth into the tough texture once more. I couldn't tell if he was living or not, or some entity on the verge of life and death. I swallowed mouthful after mouthful, feeling the mass fill my stomach, and the roots, warmed up by my flesh, they twisted and moved through my organs, laying claim to them. Two circled around my brain, and I expected to lose control of who I am, who I was. My fingertips felt numb, and I dropped to my knees. The god creature's hollow skull kept watching me, silently guiding me to consume what was left. I couldn't leave it unfinished. My jaw was tight when I sank my teeth in, chewed the coarse, tough flesh, with tears staining my cheeks, and swallowed. It dragged and clung, nearly causing me to choke. The last piece was the most painful, and a tortured whimper escaped my lips. Once the final bite was taken, I waited for the final act to occur. Sleepily, I blinked. My gaze was foggy and my head swam. I leaned on the coarse bark of a tree, gasping deeply for breath that did not come, and blinked again, only to view the world through reborn eyes. My bones twisted, yanked themselves outward, changing the shape of my skull, only to have it move backward. Perhaps it would have been better if I died. Everything was sharper now, in protest to the twisting feeling inside me. My eyeballs dropped outward and landed on the forest floor, now useless and consumed by the ground. Even without physical eyes, I could now see the god creature's yellow ones staring back at me.
I must find another, and you must see if you survive.
I could hear whispering coming from the skeletons, their words too muffled and broken for me to understand. My questions about their origins unanswered, despite not having spoken it aloud. He guided me through them. Like him, some passed through me, while others brushed up against my body. Their hands reached for me, pulling at me, only for them to fall away. And we went back outside. Sounds of animals scurrying around in the dirt and the beating of thousands of hearts filled my ears. Nocturnal birds made their loud sounds, and I found the rebirth to be unpleasant. Animals were both drawn to me, yet when they saw me they would freeze, frozen in fear. I saw a doe in the background with her fawn. They stared at me, wide-eyed and stunned at my presence. A low, deep moan echoed from their bodies, and slowly their skulls turned, bones cracking in the process. They showed me their lives, grazing, drinking water from one of the nearby streams, fleeing from hunters or wolves who wished to end their lives. The imagery soon passed. Their heads returned to their true positions, and they pranced off into the night, free from the spell of control. Days and nights passed. 1, 2, 3, up to 14 until I stopped keeping count. Time was pointless. Soon they all became one, an eternal dance, and momentarily I forgot about the god creature, my new father. After slipping from thought, I noticed every cell and every creature, no matter how minute, inside the forest. A world that had been denied to me. My wandering showed me ruined buildings of others who had risked and failed to make the forest their home, their unlawful domain. Wooden cabins, larger shells of mansions in areas that had been cleared, only for nature to reclaim that same space. Green vines and branches had claimed the brickwork for its own. All the furniture had been left to decay, along with any other possessions. I touched a chair, recognizing it, yet it felt like a shadow compared to what I used to experience. Still, my journey was not yet complete. The journey beyond the forest to what had once been my home and the center of my world. I had lost all trace of him again. He was barely a shadow in front of me, always keeping just out of pace. My heart, now replaced with his, began to beat frantically, and I darted past trees, trying to pick up any trace of him. I felt something draw me close to him. It felt like a hook inside my mind, luring me closer. I could hear a human's breathing, slow and yet steadily growing faint. I followed the sound, and after wandering for some time, I found him, the god creature. Although not like how I first met him. He was laying back, resting against the surface of a tree, and with his limbs lazily resting on either side, the roots escaping what was returning to human skin. And I saw the man he had once been. A hazel eye stared out of the socket and had two small roots piercing it on either side, and I stood close by, unsure what was happening.
My blessing now passes to you.
I didn't know which it was. My previous life barely a shadow, no longer important, and perhaps a strange dream. He closed his eye, disintegrating down into the earth, and finally barely an outline of his body remained, staring at it. I had a feeling he wasn't gone, and wondered who the man had been. More importantly, who had given the god creature his divinity. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard loud sounds coupling with red and blue flashing lights. The forest awoke, the air changed, the trees whispered, and animal life sang out. Intruder! There are intruders! I made my way toward the sound, ready to discover the source. The unnatural lights caused me to blink, lift my hand to shield my eyes, and smoke and growling from their metal boxes. The people called out to me, telling me to drop the knife, and it was only now I remembered I was still holding the weapon in my hand. It was covered in rust, the edge was split, and I looked at it more closely. I remembered the two women I killed before I was reborn. They still demanded that I drop the weapon, and now they could see me. I could sense their fear. They backed away and lingered close to their metal boxes, there with many people walking toward me with a small stick in their hands, telling me to put my hands up and drop my weapon, as though wishing to threaten me.
They do not belong here.
The first time I heard his voice, in such a long time. With a blade in my hand I approached them, and their weapon shot fire and thunder. Catching me in the chest, I rested my hand on the wound, and saw red blood instantly turn black.
Take them as sacrifices. Claim all of mankind.
A low, deep, animalistic groan cried out through the forest and echoed. The people, frightened, looked at each other, confused and riddled with an unknown fear. Some called for backup to arrive. When other calls came from the forest, other members of our kind came out, and that was when I saw the god creatures were not alone. I saw several, some with deer skulls, others with wolf ones, and others like myself that had a more human look to us. And I figured we were the youngsters, the children. Some descended out of the tree line, while others rose from the mud, reaching out from beneath the earth and pulling themselves up from behind the police officers' cars. I heard gunshots, yet none of them brought us down. All I heard in response were hostile growls and terrified screams as we kept coming. They had been summoned. Their blood would be ours. I saw their blue uniform bodies being pulled apart, but they didn't perish right away. They fired at us while screaming before the end. It was no use. The bullets sank into wood and meat to no effect. Instead, their broken bodies flailed around, gripping the ground and trying to drag themselves onward before either succumbing to their injuries or being pulled beneath the ground by ravenous roots, drawing them into the earth. Their blood and flesh would fertilize the soil. Only a final burst of blood into the air told me of their demise, their blood that would fuel us for eternity. I had momentarily forgot how fragile humanity was, and we had come to reclaim what belongs to us.
They are ours.
A few of those who had been killed rose up from their death positions, a long, deep moan coming from their lips. Their veins and tree roots were now one and the same. Together, we walked to the cities to find people and bring about a new world. The forest had awoken. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members, Patreon subscribers, and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.